Ask her.
Ask her.
Ask her
About philanthropy.
Ask her.
about change.
Ask her about power.
Ask us.
Good evening. My name is Theo Sowa, and I'm the Executive Director of the African Women's Development Fund. It's a really great privilege to be here this evening, and especially to work with the amazing women who've already spoken this evening. I'd like to start by telling you just a little bit about our organization, AWDF. It was founded by 3 really visionary African women, one from Uganda, one from Nigeria, and one from Ghana. These women had worked in a range of organizations, national and international, and for so many years they'd heard that mantra that African women were the engine for change, that African women were going to drive progress and drive development on the continent. But when they looked at where the money went, the money was never being, or rarely, being invested in African women's organizations. So they decided to set up AWDF to actually try and make sure that resources were driven and were invested in African women, in African women's organizations. So AWDF works in a range of ways. We're now 15 years old, and in that 15 years, we've established a strong, credible organization that not only gets financial and human resources to African women's organizations across the continent, but also works on women's leadership. We also work with our grantee partners on a whole range of capacity building and technical assistance initiatives, and we collaborate with African women's movements on advocacy agendas, working towards the days when African women's rights really will be achieved and fully implemented, working towards the days when all of our peoples can live in dignity and peace and with justice. For AWDF and for many women's rights activists in Africa, 2014 was a really hard year. We had to weather the storms of Ebola, watching the infections and the deaths rising steadily, especially for the women in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. And then we had to watch and see how fear and panic eroded a whole range of other women's rights in those countries. We watched horrified as the abductions of the Chibok girls highlighted the ongoing kidnap, harassment, and killing of so many of our sisters and our mothers and our daughters in northern Nigeria. We stood in solidarity with women's human rights defenders who were imprisoned in Egypt, murdered in Libya, had their centers closed down in Somalia. We were furious and humiliated as women on the streets of Kenya and Zimbabwe were stripped in public simply for choosing to wear clothes that some men did not agree with. And in the midst of all of this, the hope that we'd begun to harbor for AIDS-free generations on the continent began to be threatened by a dwindling in funding and by an increasingly medicalized approach to AIDS, which put further strain on women who'd always known that we had to deal with HIV/AIDS not only in terms of its medical impact, but also the social, the economic, and the political. So yeah, there were a lot of things that happened in 2014 to make it a really bad year to be a women's rights activist on the continent. And yet, 2014 was a year that really refreshed my belief in the resilience, the strength, the agency, the ingenuity, and just the downright determination of African women and of our activists. It was in 2014 that we witnessed the strength of spirit as women in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea fought back against Ebola with little in the way of financial resources, but so much in the way of spirit, of courage, of invention, and of commitment. We saw that same spirit reflected in the women of northern Nigeria who fought back against the extremists that would close down the rights of girls in their communities. They launched the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls, they launched the advocacy, and they set up a whole range of community responses. These are the narratives that we actually need to have heard. Someone asked me a little while ago about why it mattered to have African women's voices heard. Well, it matters for all kinds of reasons. For a start, so many of the current narratives are lies, demeaning, undermining, undignified falsehoods. African women are not victims. African women can look after our children. African women are not charity cases. And you know what? African women are not all the same. No one wants their story told that way. And what legacy, what sense of self-worth, what kind of dignity and belief do we leave for African girls if we allow that one story falsehood to continue to go ahead and be unchallenged? And in addition, sticking to false narratives is actually just downright stupid. How on earth are we meant to make any sensible, sound, relevant decisions if those decisions are driven by false perceptions? When we don't listen to or value the voices of African women, everyone loses out. We live in a world where we seem to be beset by these intractable problems that we've been trying to work on for so long. We need all of our collective intelligence, our ability, our experience, if we're going to really crack any of those problems. So when we ignore African women or distort the perceptions of African women, we end up missing out on some of the smartest, most innovative, most resilient, caring, and committed people our world has to offer. Earlier, Jessica took you to a field in the DRC when she was thinking of activism and what it meant to her. When I think of activism, I think of some of our really amazing African women. I think of the Sylvia Tamales of this world, a Ugandan academic and feminist who is awe-inspiringly intelligent, has some of the sharpest analysis and innovative, courageous approaches to a whole range of issues, but especially on issues of sexual and reproductive health and rights. I think of the Hope Chigudus of this world, whose concept of organizations with a soul, as well as her outstanding feminist analysis and her problem-solving ability, makes her invaluable to the struggle for social justice, not just in Africa, but across the world. I think of the Cynthia Kuredus of this world, from Box Girls Kenya, who says of her group, and I quote, "We fight every minute of every day to imbue girls' lives with hope, strength, and joy, using sports as a right as well as an entry point to other rights. We are young people who, despite limited experience and getting it wrong every now and again, are able to rise to the challenges posed by poverty, marginalization, and discrimination." This is someone who's about 26 years old. She puts us all to shame when she speaks. While we're here today, while you've been listening to the thoughts of the amazing women who spoke before me, I just want you to remember the millions of African women who are just as inspirational, just as accomplished, but who so rarely get the platforms that they deserve. I want you to go home remembering that African women are strong and powerful, and that we're not victims despite the range of challenges that are faced. I really want you to stop that mistaking the challenge for the person. So yes, the narrative matters. When people act as if MSF and the militaries from the global north saved Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, they're really missing the point. MSF were wonderful, and they played a crucial role, especially when people in the international communities weren't listening and weren't acknowledging what was going on. But the true first responders in the Ebola virus outbreak were the communities of those countries, and especially the women and the women's organizations in those countries. They were the people who stepped in to push back not just the death and infection from Ebola, but the other unexpected and quite often unacknowledged impacts of the virus on social and economic rights and well-being. Yet while MSF at one point was saying to the world that they didn't want or need any more of the money that was pouring into them, those same community groups were struggling to get by on tiny amounts of money. Sometimes I wonder how many times we have to learn the same lessons, because the Ebola response was like a mini déjà vu of the response early on to the HIV/AIDS pandemic, ignoring the disproportionate impact of the virus on women and girls, ignoring the stigma, discrimination, and violence that the virus heightened for women and girls, medicalizing the response instead of recognizing that physical, social, economic, and other impacts had to be dealt with at the same time, taking for granted that women would carry the burden of care with few financial resources, while huge organizations from the global north attracted large sums of money, and taking an incredibly long time to recognize that it was women, and especially grandmothers, who were keeping families and communities together, and that they were the heart of the response, which finally began to turn the tide. And yet, just as we found that hope, just as we began to turn the tide and found the hope for AIDS-free generations, the money started to go down. In my more paranoid moments, and I have many of those, I wonder about the correlation between the recognition of the power and agency of women in the HIV/AIDS response and the subsequent dwindling of the funds. Women everywhere are so often expected to provide unpaid labor and services, and I think that this is yet another case in point. These distorted narratives also matter when it comes to investing resources to tackle difficult problems. We need to know that resources are being invested in the right places. When resources are invested in treatment centers at the expense of supporting community groups who are carrying out the crucial prevention work, then the narrative that led to those decisions about the investments make a difference. AWDF, the Association of Women in Development, have an amazing website which you really should take a look at. They actually feature one piece about a piece of research that they did in 2010, where they interviewed approximately 740 women's rights organizations globally. And they found that the median budget for those 740 organizations was $20,000 US. 740 organizations, $20,000 US. And in that same year, the income for Save the Children International was $1.4 billion. And for World Vision, it was $2.6 billion. And this is despite the fact that there is all kinds of research, and recently academic research, that shows what feminists and activists have known for a long time, that women's movements are the key drivers in defending women's human rights and gender justice worldwide. Yet how can women's organizations make the even larger difference that they're capable of making when the resources flowing to them are so scarce? The narratives around the power and agency and achievement of African women and women's rights organizations at all levels should inspire all of us to make the smart investments. The investments in that agency, the investments in those organizations. We need to make better decisions about where we put our philanthropic dollars, about where we put our development dollars, and where we put our economic investment dollars. Donors have an opportunity to lead that change in perception and action. The tradition of philanthropic giving has been different to that of government aid or business investment. And I believe that the very best philanthropic practice takes risks. It looks at the longer term, bigger picture, and it asks questions that bureaucracies so often ignore. Canada's been great and has really often led the way on social justice movements and support internationally. You have the opportunity right now to hear the voices and act on the achievements of African women's organizations. You have the opportunity to ask her, and then act on it. You have the opportunity to work in collaboration and partnership rather than imposing uncontextualized decisions from a distance that makes no sense. Ask the organizations you give to about the extent to which they listen and hear local organizations they work with. Ask them about the extent to which African women are decision makers in their work, not just people who are done to. Take advantage of being private and public foundations and individual givers to really push the needle of social change and invest where it counts, even if sometimes it takes a little bit more effort on your part. That can be the difference between investing powerfully in real change led by women's organizations or deciding that you're going to give a few cents out of charity. And that difference in giving is marked. It's marked out in lives lost or lives fulfilled. It's marked out in inequity fueled or sustainable worlds that thrive. You're all here tonight because you care. And with the right information, you can make a difference with your own giving, but also with the investments that your governments make and your private sector businesses choose to make, and in which other sectors choose to make in African women's organizations. We know it can be done. On the Ebola crisis, the Carnegie Foundation in New York made a decision that the limited resources they had to invest in the crisis would be given to community organizations. They looked at our track record and came to AWDF and gave us funding, trust, and freedom to invest in women's rights organizations that we worked with and that we knew. Women's rights organizations working at the community level. And in doing that, they enabled support, an increase in depth, and greater impact in the change that women were already driving in those countries. That's an example of philanthropy and partnership, which is about solidarity rather than charity. And in fact, it reflects the type of indigenous African philanthropy that's been active on the continent for generations. But that's a story and a discussion for another time. The deliberate decision to partner with grassroots African organizations or African foundations and networks can make a huge difference in the effectiveness of your philanthropy. I'm not saying that there should be an either or in your giving. I am saying that if you listen to some of our amazing African women leaders, and I'm not talking about politicians here, but of the many women leading families, communities, social change and justice in all spheres of our lives, if you listen to them, you'll want to support their causes, you'll want to support their movements and their activism, whatever else you do in terms of your giving. So I want to thank you for being here with us tonight. I want to thank you for caring. I want to thank all of you who've supported the work of the Stephen Lewis Foundation over the years, because that's the foundation that's truly invested in women's activism in Africa, in community responses as well. And it's a foundation that now, as a result of their actions, has the results to show what a wise decision it was to invest in our communities. This evening, you've heard just a few African women presenting our analyses of challenges, articulating our own visions, and highlighting some of our views on change. I'd like to invite you to join me, to join us in celebrating the strengths and achievements of all African women in all of our wonderful and amazing and sometimes frustrating diversity, our geographic, our cultural, our economic, our political diversity. I'd like you to join us in celebrating our activism, and I'd like to remind you, just ask us.